Threads of tomorrow. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky with soft hues of peach and lavender when Asuka awoke to the faint sound of her alarm. The day felt like any other, though deep down, she sensed something was about to change. She brushed her short, auburn hair and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her hazel eyes glimmered with determination, though traces of doubt lingered in the corners. Today, she would leave her small seaside village for the first time to chase a dream that had flickered in her heart for as long as she could remember. Asuka lived in Mizutani, a sleepy little town surrounded by rolling hills and the endless ocean. Here, time moved slowly. The air always carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, and the streets were so quiet you could hear the rustling leaves even in the heart of the town. Asuka loved her home but couldn't ignore the ache for more, a yearning to explore, to write stories that would touch people's hearts. Her grandmother, Aiko, was waiting in the kitchen. Aiko had raised Asuka since she was a child, and though her hair was streaked with silver, her spirit was still as fiery as the sunflowers that grew in their garden. "You've packed everything, right?" Aiko asked, pouring tea into 2 chipped porcelain cups. Asuka nodded. "Yeah, though I keep feeling like I'm forgetting something." Aiko chuckled softly and slid a small wooden charm across the table. It was shaped like a tiny boat, carved by her grandfather years ago. "Take this," Aiko said, her voice softer now. "It's for luck, and to remind you, no matter how far you go, you'll always have a home here." Asuka held the charm tightly, feeling the weight of her grandmother's love. "Thank you, Oba-chan." Asuka boarded the train that would take her to the city of Akahara, a bustling metropolis filled with towering skyscrapers, neon lights, and endless possibilities. As the train sped away, the familiar sights of Mizutani faded into the distance, replaced by vast fields, mountains, and eventually the sprawling cityscape. Her heart raced as she stepped off the train and into the chaos of Akahara Station. The noise was overwhelming, announcements blaring, crowds rushing past, the hum of a city that never seemed to rest. Asuka clutched her bag tightly, feeling small and out of place. But amid the overwhelming energy, her excitement grew. This was where her story would begin. Asuka found a tiny apartment in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city center. It wasn't much, just a single room with a futon, a desk, and a small window that let in slivers of sunlight, but it was hers. That first night, she sat at her desk, staring at a blank notebook, trying to capture the whirlwind of emotions she felt. Words flowed onto the page, messy but honest. "Today, I took my first step into the unknown. It's scary, but isn't that what life is? A series of steps into the dark, hoping to find light. I don't know what lies ahead, but I think that's what makes it beautiful." Asuka smiled as she closed the notebook. She felt like she was finally living the kind of story she had always dreamed of writing. Over the next few weeks, Asuka immersed herself in the city. She found work at a small bookstore tucked away in a quiet alley. The shop was run by a kind, elderly man named Mr. Hoshino, who reminded her of her grandfather. He had a habit of humming old folk songs while dusting the shelves and often shared stories about the people who frequented the shop. One day, as Asuka was arranging books, a boy her age walked in. He had messy black hair, sharp features, and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He looked like the kind of person who carried secrets. "Looking for anything specific?" Asuka asked, trying to sound professional. The boy glanced at her, then at the shelves. "Not really. Just something that makes you feel alive, you know?" Asuka tilted her head. "Alive? That's a pretty big ask for a book." The boy chuckled. "Maybe. But if anyone knows, it's probably you." He introduced himself as Run, a photography student with a penchant for capturing fleeting moments, raindrops on windows, a child's laughter, the way sunlight filtered through trees. Over time, Rin became a regular at the bookstore, and he and Asuka struck up an easy friendship. They would spend hours talking about their dreams, Asuka's of becoming a writer, and Ren's of capturing the perfect photograph. As the months passed, Asuka's life began to take shape. She wrote stories late into the night, pouring her heart onto the page. Some were inspired by her own experiences, while others came from the people she met in the city, like the old woman who sat on the same park bench every day, feeding the birds, or the street musician who played haunting melodies on a violin. But it wasn't always easy. There were days when self-doubt crept in, when rejection letters piled up, and the weight of loneliness became unbearable. On those days, Asuka would call Aiko, who always knew exactly what to say to lift her spirits. "You're stronger than you think, Asuka," Aiko would say. Even the brightest stars had to start as tiny sparks. One evening, Asuka and Rin sat on a hill overlooking the city. The skyline glittered like a sea of stars, and a cool breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves. "Do you ever feel like we're all just small threads in this huge tapestry?" Rin asked, his voice thoughtful. "Like our lives are connected in ways we can't even see?" Asuka nodded. "Yeah, but I think that's what makes it special. Even the smallest thread can change the whole pattern." Rin smiled, snapping a photo of the city below. "You're going to write something amazing one day, Asuka. I can feel it." Asuka felt her cheeks flush. "And you're going to take photos that make people see the world differently." They sat in comfortable silence, both filled with a quiet hope for the future. Years later, Asuka's stories began to gain recognition. Her first novel, inspired by the people and moments that shaped her journey, became a bestseller. Readers wrote to her, sharing how her words had touched their hearts, how they saw pieces of themselves in her characters. Run, too, found success. His photographs were displayed in galleries, each one telling a story of its own. But despite their achievements, what they cherished most were the memories of those early days, when life was uncertain, but full of possibility. And through it all, Asuka kept the little wooden charm her grandmother had given her. It sat on her desk, a reminder of where she had come from and the people who had shaped her life. Because in the end, Asuka realized it wasn't just her story. It was the story of everyone she had ever met, every moment she had ever lived, a tapestry woven from countless threads, each one shining in its own way. Asuka's days in Akahara grew busier with time. After the success of her first novel, publishers clamored for more. Her stories had a way of digging into the quiet, unspoken corners of life, and her readers often said her words felt like a warm hand reaching out to them in the dark. But as much as she loved her work, Asuka sometimes longed for the simplicity of Mizutani. She missed the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the smell of jasmine in the summer, and most of all, the quiet mornings spent sipping tea with her grandmother. One afternoon, Asuka was sorting through a pile of fan letters when a plain, unassuming envelope caught her eye. It wasn't from a reader or a publisher. It was from home. Inside was a short note from one of her grandmother's neighbors. Dear Asuka, Aiko-sen hasn't been feeling well lately. She won't admit it, but I thought you should know. She talks about you every day. Asuka's heart sank. She had been so caught up in her new life that she hadn't visited home in over a year. She immediately packed her bags and caught the first train back to Mizutani. The familiar scent of the sea greeted her as she stepped off the train. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the town. As Asuka walked through the quiet streets, memories flooded back. Playing in the fields as a child, listening to her grandmother's stories by the fire, the way life here felt slower but fuller. When she reached the small wooden house where she had grown up, Asuka saw her grandmother sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Aiko's face lit up when she saw her granddaughter. Asuka, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. You're here. Asuka ran to her and hugged her tightly. Oba-chan, I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. Aiko smiled, patting her on the back. You're here now. That's all that matters. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Asuka. Aiko's health had indeed weakened. Her steps were slower, and she tired easily, but her spirit remained as strong as ever. Asuka fell back into the rhythm of life in Mizutani. She helped Aiko tend to the garden, cooked meals for her, and listened to her stories late into the night. The simplicity of it all reminded Asuka of what truly mattered. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Aiko said, I've always known you'd leave this town one day, but I also knew you'd come back when it mattered. Asuka held her grandmother's hand. I'll never forget where I came from, Oba-chan. This is home. A week after Asuka arrived in Mizutani, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Rin standing there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. His black hair was messier than usual, and he looked slightly out of breath. Ren, Asuka said, surprised. What are you doing here? He scratched the back of his neck, looking a little sheepish. I heard you went home, and I wanted to see you. Asuka's heart fluttered. Ren had always been a good friend, but lately, her feelings for him had grown deeper, though she wasn't sure if he felt the same. Aiko, who had been listening from the kitchen, appeared in the doorway with a knowing smile. Come in, young man. I was wondering when you'd show up. Ren stayed in Mizutani for a few days, and during that time, he and Asuka grew even closer. They walked along the beach, explored the fields where Asuka had played as a child, and talked for hours about their dreams and fears. One evening, As they watched the sun set over the ocean, Ren turned to Asuka. You know, I've been thinking about what you said once, that even the smallest thread can change the whole tapestry. You've been that thread for me, Asuka. You've changed my life in ways I can't even explain. Asuka's breath caught in her throat. Ren, before she could say anything more, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small photograph. It was of Asuka, sitting at her desk in the bookstore back in Akahara, completely absorbed in her writing. I took this the first week we met, Ren admitted. Even then, I knew you were going to do incredible things. And I think I've loved you ever since. Tears welled up in Asuka's eyes. I felt the same way, but I was too scared to say it. Ren smiled, taking her hand. Well, I'm saying it now, and I'm not going anywhere. A few weeks later, Ren returned to Mizutani with a plan. He brought Asuka to her grandmother's garden, which was now blooming with sunflowers. As they stood among the flowers, Ren got down on one knee and held out a simple silver ring. Asuka, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. You've been the light in my life, the one who always sees beauty in the smallest things. Will you marry me? Asuka's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Yes. Of course, yes. Aiko, who had been watching from the porch, clapped her hands together. About time, she called out, laughing. Asuka and Rin decided to hold their wedding in Mizutani, surrounded by the people who had shaped their lives. The ceremony took place on the beach, with the sound of waves as their backdrop. Aiko, despite her frailty, stood proudly by Asuka's side, her eyes shining with pride. After the wedding, Asuka and Rin settled in Mizutani, splitting their time between the quiet beauty of the village and the bustling creativity of the city. Asuka continued to write, and Ren's photographs began to gain international recognition. Together, they built a life filled with love, art, and shared dreams. And every night, as they sat on the porch of their little house, watching the stars, Asuka would hold the wooden charm her grandmother had given her and think about how far she had come and how much more there was to look forward to. Because in the end, life wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the people you shared the journey with, the moments that left their mark on your heart, and the threads that wove it all together.